Good evening and welcome to the E.H. Carr Memorial Lecture. This is the 31st year in the series of Carr Lectures, and somebody told me recently that, somebody in the United States told me recently that they had heard somebody say that this is now the most prestigious named lecture series in our discipline. It wasn't somebody from the department who said this, it was somebody outside in the United States. Edward Hallett Carr was the fourth Woodrow Wilson professor in the department, and he was here between 1936 and 1947. During these years, he consolidated his reputation as being one of the leading intellectuals in British life. He had a tempestuous relationship with the endower of the Wilson Chair, David Davis, and the two of them came to embody the so-called debate between so-called idealism and so-called realism, and in this way came to add to the folklore of our discipline. And in these 11 years, Carr wrote an enormous number of articles and books in different formats, newspapers and academic journals. And much of this still meets the test of time. Most famously, of course, for students in this discipline, his book, The 20 Years Crisis, stands out. It's never been out of print since it was first published in 1939. And every serious student of international politics and international relations has to engage with that book at some point, has, I would say, to read it at least 3 times. Carr died in 1982 at the grand old age of 90. And these lectures were the inspired idea of a former colleague, Brian Porter. The first of the lectures was in 1984. In the early days, the lectures were sponsored by the so-called Aberystwyth Papers Fund. The Aberystwyth Papers, some of you will know, was the title of the book of the famous conference that, again, Brian Porter conceived, which was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the department's founding. This was held, as some of you will know, in 1969. And I'm happy to say that the department of our speaker this evening is celebrating its 50th birthday in a couple of weeks' time. More recently, when the Aberystwyth Papers Fund diminished to zero, more recently the lecture series has been funded by the publishers Sage, who publish the journal International Relations, in which the written version of this lecture will eventually appear. And I must give my thanks to Sage for their very generous support, not only of this lecture, but also of other activities in the department. Over the years, the Carr Lecture has been given by a veritable who's who of distinguished figures who have something to say about international relations. Founding figures in the discipline, like Bill Fox, who gave the first one in 1984, international historians, Zara Steiner, philosophers, Raymond Geuss, who gave the lecture last year, political theorists, Brian Barry, sociologist, Ernest Gellner, international lawyers, Marty Koskaniemi, key US giants of US IR theory, like Robert Cohane and John Mersheimer, and giants of theorists in the United Kingdom, like Fred Halliday and our own Andrew Linklater, before he became the present Woodrow Wilson Professor. Joining this very distinguished list this evening, I want to welcome Professor Justin Rosenberg from the University of Sussex. Justin has had a distinctive voice in the field for the last 20 plus years, and its distinctiveness comes from the fact that he works at the intersections of a number of different traditions of thought: international relations theory, social theory, historical sociology, and Marxist theorizing, all mixed up and combined, to use a favorite word of our speaker, all combined with his own distinctive voice, which comes in part from having a degree in English and having done a lot of sociology in his time. There was a first phase, Rosenberg, which looked at IR theories, criticized IR theories from the perspective of these intersections that I mentioned. And then there is a second phase, Rosenberg, that has turned around the telescope in a sense and looks at the significance of the international for thinking about social theorizing in other areas of the social sciences and humanities. His books are widely cited: The Empire of Civil Society and the Follies of Globalization Theory. Justin began his career at LSE, moved to Sussex in 1998, and has been there since. He recently gave up being head of department. It's a real pleasure for me, because I don't know Justin very well, but I've always been very sympathetic with his work. So it's a real pleasure to have him here to talk about IR in the prison of political science. Is there a way out? Can I ask you to give a big ABBA vote of appreciation to Justin? Well done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken, for your kind words, and thank you for inviting me to give this most prestigious lecture in the whole discipline. I was also told that by colleagues who were not related to Aberystwyth, so I feel very honoured by the occasion. Thank you for that, and thank you to all of you for coming this evening. I have a rather grim image on the screen there, which in a way is the complete opposite of how I want to begin my talk this evening. Because what I really want to begin by saying is this: congratulations. The discipline of international relations is nearly 100 years old. Given the unique role of Aberystwyth in this achievement, I'm sure that preparations must soon be underway for a big centenary event in 2019. I'd love to be there, because there's going to be so much to celebrate. The field of international relations today is more exciting, more diverse, more creative, and more politically engaged than ever before. It attracts growing numbers of students, and deep ongoing changes in the world order mean that the need for a discipline of IR has never been more obvious. It's a great discipline to be in. Now, I don't want to spoil the party before it's even happened, but I'm sure I'm not alone in noticing that international relations today is also experiencing a kind of crisis of confidence. In 2013, the European Journal of International Relations published a special issue, I'm sure many of you have seen it, called The End of IR Theory, in which the editors suggested that IR seemed to be exhausted and no longer producing big ideas. By contrast, around the same time, Ola Weaver has argued that international relations today contains more theory than ever, except that it's not IR theory, but theory imported from other disciplines. Christine Sylvester has analysed how all this theory is fragmented among numerous intellectual camps which no longer have a shared conversation about their common subject matter. Everybody's sitting around their own campfires, validating their sectarian position. There no longer is a common conversation about IR. And in this sense, she claims, it is indeed possible, and I quote, that IR theory per se is at an end. But here's the worst bit. If so, it's apparently not an end that is going to be particularly noticed elsewhere in the social sciences. Because as Chris Brown recently reminded us again, the external impact of international theory has been more or less negligible. IR has imported numerous ideas, but the traffic has been almost entirely one way. In fact, IR's disciplinary credentials are apparently so weak that in 2015, the Annual Review of Political Science actually published an article called "Should We Leave the Subfield of Leave Behind the Subfield of International Relations?" The nerve of it. In this article, the author considered whether, and I quote, "the IR subfield should be abandoned and its pieces allocated to new subfields of conflict, institutions, political economy, and political behaviour." Well, fellow students of IR, I have to tell you, we've had a narrow escape, because he eventually concluded that international relations should be left, for now, but mainly because breaking it up would cause new boundary issues among the replacement subfields. There was no suggestion at all in his argument that IR might actually have an important contribution of its own to make to the social sciences. So why are we in this peculiar situation? Why has the great flowering of IR as a field been unable to shake off this sense of failure and vulnerability? And what can be done about it? In this lecture tonight, I want to answer these questions in three main steps. First, I want to suggest that, strangely, IR has never quite been established as a field in its own right. It emerged as an extension of political science and has remained more or less trapped within a borrowed ontology. And I call this the prison of political science, and I think it explains our failure to produce ideas that can travel to other disciplines. But secondly, I want to argue that this is not a necessary fate at all. IR rests on a fundamental fact about the human world that is full of implications for the social sciences. This is, of course, the fact that the human world comprises a multiplicity of coexisting societies. And I think that knowing how to take intellectual possession of this fact and how to draw out its implications for other fields, these really are the key to reversing our intellectual trade deficit and developing ideas that can travel creatively. And so finally, I want to give an example of one such idea which I think could become a successful export from IR because it carries the importance of the international directly into the subject matter of other disciplines. And that's the idea of uneven and combined development. But let me start by going back to the thinker whose memory we're honouring tonight, E.H. Carr. Because one of the glories of the 20 Years' Crisis is that every time we reread this book, Carr, in effect, invites us to go back with him to the very origins of IR as a discipline and to debate with him precisely this question of what are the intellectual foundations on which the infant discipline of IR should be built. And not only does Carr provide his own answer to this question, but this answer enables us to see the prison of political science while it is still under construction. It happens about a third of the way through the book, at the start of chapter 7. And this is where Carr switches from negative critique and starts to make his own foundational moves. And it looks at first as if he gets off to a flying start. Man, he tells us in the opening sentence, has always lived in groups. Let's remove the sexism by changing man to humanity. And it then appears that Carr has gone straight for that universal fact about the social world that must be the starting point for our discipline, the coexistence of multiple social entities. Surely, if he now reflects on this, he will uncover both the distinctiveness of this object of study and its implications for social existence in general, and the disciplinary credentials of IR will be firmly established. But alas, this is not what happens next. When Carr talked about humans living in groups, his use of the plural word groups was almost incidental. He wasn't referring to the coexistence of multiple societies. What he actually meant was that humans are social animals who live together in groups of various kinds. And even this was just a means of getting to the foundational statement that he really wants to make, which is a statement about politics. Because individual humans always exist in a group, he says, one of the functions of such a group has been to regulate relations between its members. And then he immediately adds, politics deals with the behavior of men inside organized groups. Now from here, Carr goes on to add 3 further points. First, he says, in groups, people behave in both egoistic and cooperative ways. Second, although the political group, the state, is unique in being a compulsory association, it too exhibits this duality because it rests on both coercion and legitimacy. And finally, all this is no less true of international politics than it is of domestic politics. The infancy of the science of international politics lies in the fact that it has not yet come to terms with this twofold character of its subject matter. Only, says Carr, when its initial utopian hopes have been balanced by a realist analysis, only then will this new field pass out of its infancy and become a social science. Now, in one sense, it's hard to object to this chain of reasoning. After all, Carr calls this chapter the nature of politics. And the basic point that he's making is Aristotle's point that because humans live in groups, there is an irreducibly political dimension to their existence. Nonetheless, I do think there's a real problem here. Carr is supposedly laying the foundations for a discipline of international relations. But the way he does this is not to identify what premises of its own the international might uniquely contain. It is rather to extend the premises of the political into the international. And it's this that grounds IR in an ontology borrowed from political science. And to see why this is a problem, we need, I think, to reflect for a minute about academic disciplines. As we know, the study of the human world is distributed across a range of social sciences and humanities. People often lament this fragmentation, but the division of labour does bring benefits as well. If you think about it, each discipline foregrounds a particular dimension of social reality and makes it the object of an organised inquiry. It then analyses both this dimension in itself and its wider significance for human affairs. And as a result of this specialisation, the analysis surely goes much deeper than it would otherwise have done. So, for example, geography specialises in the spatial dimension of human and natural existence, both what space means for society and how space is itself socially constructed in different ways, in different times and places. It's about, at the deep level, it's about spatiality. Similarly, history ultimately subtends on our existence in time, which explains its preoccupation with historical specificity, causal sequencing, and narrative forms of explanatory method. Temporality is to history what spatiality is to geography. Sociology is grounded in the fact that human lives are always carried on within wider structures of social relations. Society is its special object. It's no wonder that the agent-structure debate is perennial to that discipline. Sociology is, after all, the original home of the very idea of social structure. One last example, comparative literature. Comparative literature is not just the study of different national traditions of creative writing. At a deeper level, it's also about the properties of language itself, and about how, by extension, the social world at large, which is also linguistically mediated and produced, exhibits properties of textuality that invite hermeneutic deconstruction and analysis. Now, in each of these four cases, an academic discipline rests upon a specific feature of social reality: spatiality, temporality, social structure, and textuality. But here's the interesting thing. This very specialization is at the same time the secret of their interdisciplinary potential. It's precisely because each of these disciplines has taken possession of something that is in fact general to the social world. It's because of that that their local investigations can produce concepts that can suddenly travel and be applied right across the human sciences. And we see this happening again and again, whether it's the spatial turn coming out of geography, the Braudelian idea of temporal conjuncture from history, Wallerstein's world systems theory, which of course originated in sociology, or indeed post-structural and post-colonial theories today, in which literary scholars like Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, and so on have played such a prominent role. In all these cases, I would say that the reason that a given discipline can speak to other disciplines and has something to say to them is precisely because it has specialized in a particular feature of social reality that is nonetheless general to the social world. So, the question naturally arises: what general feature is the special preserve of IR as an intellectual discipline, enabling us to speak to other disciplines in our own language about their particular subject matter? If we ask this question of the 20 Years' Crisis, the answer actually is nothing. IR emerges from its infancy not by finding its own voice and object, but by accepting that it is simply an extension of another discipline, the science of politics. Only when the same assumptions are accepted for international politics, as have been since Aristotle recognized for politics, only then will the science of IR exist. And here I think we can see the foundations of the prism being laid. Because if IR is just a subfield of political science, then the only identity available for it becomes a negative one. It studies politics, but in the absence of central authority. And so the international itself becomes associated with the narrow version of it provided by political realism. And once that has happened, the possibility of IR producing ideas that can travel to other disciplines evaporates. As a result of this, to take in a way, an exception that proves the rule, even the work of Kenneth Waltz, who certainly did assert the distinctiveness of the international, has two characteristics deriving from this history of the foundation of the discipline which prevent it from having interdisciplinary significance. And it's one of the things that Chris Brown says in his article, what's amazing is that even someone like Ken Waltz, who is such a giant, and rightly so in our discipline, is almost unknown outside it. So what are these characteristics that prevent Waltz's work from having interdisciplinary significance? Well, the first is that he himself defined international theory as international political theory. It emphatically did not embrace a wider condition of internationality with implications beyond political science. And Waltz repeatedly challenged his critics to show how such an extension could be made without just replacing theory with thick description. And secondly, Waltz conceptualized the international famously as separate from and counterposed to the domestic realm. About that domestic social world, neorealism quite literally had nothing to say except to note how different it was from the world of international politics that existed alongside it. So it played a huge comparative role in sharpening the definition of the international by contrast. But it did so in such a way as to cut off our understanding of the international from the rest of the social world. Now, of course, realism has not had the field of IR to itself. Numerous other approaches have rejected both the narrow statist definition of the international and the whole idea of an autonomy of geopolitics. And the sheer range of these alternatives, from liberalism, Marxism, and feminism, through to constructivism, post-colonialism, queer theory, and so on, I think accounts for much of the tremendous vibrancy of IR today. But here's the thing. How many of these challenges have replaced realism with theories of their own that are actually based on the distinctive properties of the international? How many of them have grounded the field of IR in a concept of the international itself? I think the answer is pretty much none. And I think that's because all these other approaches regard the idea of the international as part of the toxic legacy of realism. It's an understandable phobia, but I think it leads them to conclude that international affairs must therefore be shaped by other aspects of the social world and are therefore best interpreted by ideas imported from the disciplines that study those other aspects. But of course, if you declare that sociology or history or anthropology holds the key to understanding IR's subject matter, then you effectively turn IR into a subfield of sociology, history, or anthropology. The downside to IR's wonderful openness to other disciplines is that if we have no deep ontology of our own, we become, in effect, everybody's subfield. So I think we should hardly be surprised that no big ideas have travelled outwards from IR. Any such ideas would have to be about the unique importance of the international for the human world. But the realists have defined it too narrowly for this role, and the anti-realists, myself included in the past, have steered clear of the uniqueness of the international because they associate it with realist claims about anarchy and power politics, which they're determined to refute. So I call this situation the prison of political science for three main reasons. First, I think its ultimate source still lies in the continuing failure of IR to emancipate itself from political science. Second, this situation confines IR within the premises of an alien discipline, preventing it from developing freely and realizing its own potential as a viewpoint on the social world. And finally, just like in a real prison, IR can receive visits, but it cannot repay them. It can import ideas from outside, but it cannot send anything back in return. Whatever the significance of the international may be for the wider social sciences, they don't get to see it. It's locked away inside the prison. But now I want to argue that this is not a necessary predicament at all. Just like geography, history, sociology, and so on, IR has an ontology of its own, one with enormous significance for all the human sciences. This ontology is not the property of any one particular approach, of any one of those campfires that Christine Sylvester described so memorably. It's our shared inheritance as a discipline, and I think it's our way out of the prison of political science. So, let's return to that big question. If geography subtends on our existence in space, and if sociology analyzes the relational quality of human life, what general feature of the social world provides IR with its deepest ontological premise? Well, in my experience, no matter how much we twist and turn this word international in our hands, it always ends up presupposing the same basic thing, namely, that human existence is not unitary, but multiple. It is distributed across numerous interacting societies. This is the basic fact about the human world that justifies the existence of IR as an academic discipline. No other discipline, not even political science, subtends fundamentally on this fact of societal multiplicity. It's uniquely our ontological premise. And it has remarkable consequences for the social sciences. Some of these consequences are half known to us already, but I think we half know them under the negative sign bequeathed to us by political science, the sign of the absence of overarching government. We do not yet know them fully under the positive sign of the international, the co-presence of multiple interacting societies. And when it comes to IR finding its own voice among the disciplines, I think that switching signs makes all the difference in the world. So, what are these consequences? The first and most profound one, the one that opens the box for everything else, is this. At its highest level, the human world does not culminate in a single authority, but nor does it just tail off into empty space. Instead, it opens out into a lateral field of coexisting societies. This field of coexistence adds a whole new layer of social reality beyond the internal structures of any individual society. And the result is not simply that the human world is bigger, it also contains a whole extra kind of social phenomena, intersocietal relations, intersocietal behavior, intersocietal ethical norms, and intersocietal causality. In other words, multiplicity generates the international itself as a dimension of the social world. And clearly, it is the special remit of IR to bring this dimension into focus and construct it as an object of study. Is this just going to lead us back to realism? Well, to find out, let's unpack the other consequences of multiplicity. I think the second consequence is difference. And that's because the quantitative multiplicity of societies is also a qualitative one. Now, we know this to be the case empirically. We know that societies differ from each other in all kinds of ways: size, power, culture, history, and so on. But I want to suggest that difference is a necessary consequence of multiplicity itself. The reason for this is partly that multiple societies must vary in their geographical location and are therefore differently influenced by the physical variety of the Earth itself. But difference also obtains because the distribution of social development across more than one society allows it to take different forms in different places at the same time. As we know, one of the most distinctive attributes of humans as a species is our ability to construct our social existence in radically different ways, and then for those different ways themselves to undergo historical development and change. Multiplicity converts this attribute into a concrete variety of societies that actually coexist in space and time. And that, I think, is really important because it means that the international inscribes difference and multilinearity into the nature of social development itself. But multiplicity is not just about coexistence and difference. It also compels societies into interaction. And this is because it imposes a common condition on all societies. They all confront the fact that the human world extends beyond themselves. And that is a source, as we know, both of dangers and of opportunities. It's a danger because processes occurring outside can become threats to a society's interests or even survival. During the long 19th century, dozens of Asian and African societies were completely overwhelmed and extinguished as independent political entities because the Industrial Revolution happening elsewhere had increased the power of European states whose very existence had barely been known to them before. But it's also an opportunity because differences between societies can be the basis for trade and for importing knowledge and resources produced by differential development elsewhere. So multiplicity leads to interaction because societies have to manage their external environment through diplomatic and military means in order to survive. And if they want to benefit from the opportunities of difference, they have to develop structures of interdependence too. And in fact, as we know, all modern societies do both of these all the time. This is international relations as mainstream IR theory knows it: geopolitics and interdependence. But the implications of multiplicity don't stop there. And that's because interaction brings with it a fourth consequence. No society undergoes a history that is truly unilinear and self-enclosed. All societies are therefore, to a greater or lesser extent, ongoing combinations of local patterns of development with external influences and pressures of all kinds. And this can apply even to their most apparently indigenous elements. What could appear more English than the English language? And yet we know, it only takes a minute to reflect, and we know that it's actually a mixture of the Latin, Saxon, Norse, and French languages, among others. And those different ingredients are not just linguistic influences, they're the sedimentation in language of the influence of the Romans, Saxons, Vikings, and Normans on Britain's social and political history as well. And this, I think, has a really dramatic implication, both for international relations and for all the other social sciences, because it shows us that the international dimension is not simply a matter of external relations. Through interaction, multiplicity reaches into the inner constitution of societies themselves. But finally, if human societies are multiple, varied, and interactive, then it also follows that the process of world development overall cannot be unilinear or even just multilinear. It must be a fully dialectical process. Let me give an example to illustrate what I mean. In 1620, Francis Bacon wrote that the modern world was marked off from the past by the impact of three main inventions: gunpowder, the printing press, and the magnetic compass. Between them, he wrote, these inventions had done more than any empire or religion to lift Europe out of the darkness of the Middle Ages. Now, Bacon didn't know this, but all three of these inventions had originated in China and had been transferred to Europe through processes of indirect trade and communication. But this is not just a general point about interconnection, because, of course, when they turned up in Europe, these Chinese inventions were inserted into a completely different social setting, and they were therefore developed in new directions and with results that they never had in China and were probably never going to have in China. The same can be said of the transfer of classical Greek learning from the Arab world to Europe at the start of the Renaissance, or indeed of the original translation of Greek philosophy into Arabic 300 years or so before. In all these cases, the dialogical transfer of something out of one society and into another sets in train a new and different process of development that inflects the wider course of world history itself. And conversely, viewed in that wider frame, even something like the rise of the West turns out to have been rooted in a dialectical causality generated by the interactions of multiple societies. So what do these 5 points tell us about the subject matter of IR? I think they tell us that the international is an even bigger deal than we normally take it to be. It certainly is the field of geopolitics and interdependence that realist and liberal theories say it is, but it is also the implications of societal multiplicity for all the so-called domestic aspects of social life as well, for social structures, economic systems, intellectual production, cultural phenomena, and so on. Or to put it another way, a discipline of IR should certainly try to understand what is happening in international politics, but it should also elaborate the significance of societal multiplicity for the social world as a whole. And this, I think, is our passport out of the prison of political science, because it means that we finally have something to say to other disciplines about their subject matter. Instead of only talking about the significance of class, gender, language, and so on for IR, we can also explore the significance of the international for the construction of class, gender, language, and so on as well. What's more, this is actually something that these other disciplines need and maybe even want to hear. I say that because one of the knottiest problems in the social sciences is the problem of methodological nationalism. It's a problem that goes all the way back to the classical social theorists themselves, including Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. We see it in their tendency at a deep theoretical level to conceptualize society in the singular, and in their failure, therefore, to theorize the consequences of multiplicity for social reality. From this intellectual source in classical social theory, the problem is carried forward into contemporary theory, where as many writers, from Theda Skocpol to Zygmunt Bauman to Ulrich Beck, have observed, it continues to hamper social analysis. In his book, Intimations of Postmodernity, Zygmunt Bauman quails at the thought of what it would take to overcome this problem. Modelling the intersocietal space, he says at one point, is a harder challenge than anything the sociologists tried to grasp intellectually in the past. But I think that we in IR ought to have the solution to this. And that's obviously not because we're any more intelligent than the sociologists. It's simply because societal multiplicity happens to be the general feature of the social world that is specific to us as a discipline. Because it's been locked up inside political science, it hasn't been available to other disciplines in a form that they could use. As a result, the international has been, in effect, the missing piece of the jigsaw of the social sciences. But if we can reground IR in its own ontology of multiplicity, that piece can finally be put back into place. Now, of course, for that to happen, we now need ideas that operationalize all this, ideas that make the international exportable to other disciplines by showing its importance for their subject matter. I can think of at least one such idea that we already have, and that's the theory of uneven and combined development. As I'm sure you all know, this theory was originally formulated completely outside IR by Leon Trotsky, at the start of the 20th century. But it works precisely by operationalizing the 5 consequences of multiplicity that I've been outlining. And this enabled Trotsky to overcome a major instance of methodological nationalism at the time. Let me first explain what I mean by that, and then go on to say how this theory reimagines the international in a way that carries its significance beyond the discipline of IR. At the start of the 20th century, Tsarist Russia was undergoing rapid capitalist development. But it was not retracing the experience of the Western countries as the Communist Manifesto apparently implied that it should. Marx and Engels say there that capitalism was going to create a world in its own image, wherever it spread. But state-led industrialization in Russia was producing quite different social structures from those of Western Europe. And since the Russian Marxists drew their worldview from the manifesto, this meant that they were increasingly left without a coherent political analysis or strategy. And this is the problem that Trotsky solved by arguing that modern world development is not unilinear, but rather uneven and combined. So let's see how he did this. He began, in effect, by invoking the first 2 consequences of multiplicity. Because what Trotsky meant by unevenness was that capitalism had emerged into a world of coexisting societies of different kinds and levels of development. Next, he argued that this unevenness produced a mixture of dangers and opportunities that intensified international interactions. On the one hand, the growing power of capitalist states imposed a geopolitical whip of external necessity onto all other societies. If they could not reproduce this new kind of power of industrial capitalist societies inside themselves, they would be consumed by the European empires, as indeed, of course, most of them were. On the other hand, this same historical unevenness gave them a paradoxical opportunity too, which Trotsky called the privilege of historic backwardness. And I always need to say at this point that when he uses the term backwardness, he means it as a chronological category, coming later to a process that has already begun. He doesn't mean it as a kind of imputation of stupidity or kind of primitive behavior. So he's talking about latecomers to a process of industrialization that has already begun elsewhere. And the privilege that he sees them obtaining through their latecoming is that they did not have to retrace the slow, haphazard development of the pioneers. They could import its latest technological and financial results from outside because they were coexisting with other societies who had already advanced further down that road. And in this way, coexistence and difference among societies created the possibility of accelerated development among latecomers such as Russia. But it also meant that these latecomers would not become copies of the pioneer societies. After all, Russian Tsarism had no intention of transforming itself into a British-style constitutional monarchy, let alone a copy of Republican France. On the contrary, Tsarism was importing foreign inventions and resources in order to shore up its own survival. The result, therefore, was not repetition, but combination, or as Trotsky called it, combined development. Elements of modern capitalist society were being grafted onto a semi-feudal social structure to produce a unique hybrid of the old and the new, in which the original sequence of developmental stages that was apparently being imitated was in fact being compressed and even reordered in various ways. Now, what Trotsky was discovering here, I sometimes think without fully realizing it, was the difference that societal multiplicity was making to the history of capitalist world development. But what he certainly did realize was that as a result of this difference, the overall shape of that history was dialectically altering as well. Now, Trotsky referred to this big picture as the social structure of humanity. And he argued that it did not comprise a homogeneous world of capitalist states that were just at different stages of a uniform development. It wasn't just a multilinear world. Instead, East-West interactions had produced peculiar social structures in the catch-up societies, making them paradoxically closer to anti-capitalist revolution than were the advanced Western societies where Marx had expected the first revolutions to occur. In this way, the international, conceived here as uneven and combined development, had dialectically transferred the trigger of world revolution away from the Western countries. This was an outcome that Marx's largely unilinear theory could not have foreseen. But Trotsky's analysis now transformed it from a baffling contradiction into an enabling condition of political action. Now, I'm not actually a Trotskyist, and I never have been a Trotskyist. But as an international theorist, I can't let go of this idea of uneven and combined development. And that's because its inner logic is the exact inverse of E.H. Carr's in the 20 Years' Crisis. Carr, you remember, argued from the nature of politics to the nature of the international. Trotsky's idea, by contrast, is all about how deeply the fact of the international can reshape the dynamics of political development and change. And by inverting the direction of the analysis in this way, it looks to me like the kind of big idea that could be exported from IR into the other social sciences. After all, the world today is full of striking instances of combined development. The largest, in every sense, is surely China, a country that endured a whip of external necessity so intense and prolonged that they call it the century of humiliations. Using the privilege of historic backwardness, Chinese industrialization is now occurring on an even more accelerated, compressed scale than other late developers before it. And like others before it, Chinese combined development is also producing a peculiar hybrid social formation. Capitalist industrialization, organized by a semi-feudal czarist monarchy, was weird enough. But capitalism presided over by a communist state is surely the weirdest, most paradoxical combination so far. But of course, it's far from being the only one. In Saudi Arabia, a tribal system of politics has been grafted onto an industrializing society, so that the state, which owns the wealth of society, is itself the property of a 7,000-strong extended family of princes. The forcing together of different kinds of society doesn't come much more extreme than that, and yet a significant chunk of the world's energy supply rests on this peculiar political hybrid, and the events of 9/11 showed just how unstable this hybrid could be. Meanwhile, in Iran, a theocratic revolution that has no precedent in Shia Islam, let alone in the textbooks of Western social theory, has been locked in a confrontation with the great powers over its use of advanced nuclear technology. Islamic Republic, the very name, announces the fusion of traditional and modern elements. I think that because we live with these examples every day, we forget how truly peculiar they are. Their existence could never be explained by internal development alone. International pressures and opportunities have created these hybrids and woven them into the social structure of humanity. They demonstrate the relevance of Trotsky's idea in contemporary social analysis. But they also do something else. They help us to finally correct the balance between IR and political science. For nearly a century now, political realists have defined IR as a subfield of political science. We already know that it's much more than that. The consequences of societal multiplicity extend across all the different fields of human action and thought. But among these different fields is, of course, political science itself. If it now turns out that the real-world political systems studied by political science have themselves been interactively produced, and this is what explains their individual peculiarities, then it must follow that, in this respect, political science is a subfield of IR. The point is worth savouring, but we shouldn't press it in an imperialistic way, because, of course, the logic of my argument about academic disciplines is that all disciplines are subfields of all the others with regard to the particular aspects of social reality that those others have made their own. All of them should be both importers and exporters of ideas. The anomaly of IR was that it was only an importer, and that was because it had not found an independent foundation of its own, but was locked up inside political science. Let me end by pressing this argument one step further, using an example from comparative literature. Trotsky notes at one point that Russian thought, like the Russian economy, developed under the direct pressure of the higher thought and more developed economies of the West. That sounds at first like an awfully mechanical formula, but I think it doesn't have to be. It could be the first step in an extension of uneven and combined development from the social sciences and into the humanities. There it could provide a framework for uncovering the international history of ideas and of cultural production in particular. And I think a brilliant example of what this might mean has been provided by a Brazilian writer called Roberto Schwartz. Roberto Schwartz is a Brazilian literary critic, and he analyzes the rise of the Brazilian novel after national independence in 1822. And he argues that this literary trajectory was part of a wider cultural process in which a new Brazilian intelligentsia was scrambling to assemble what were then seen as the accoutrements of modern civilized society. The European novel, a literary form that gave expression to new kinds of private and public identity associated with bourgeois society, this was among the most prominent of these accoutrements. Brazil must therefore produce novels of its own. But there was a problem. Unlike England and France, 19th century Brazil was not a bourgeois society. On the contrary, it was based on aristocracy, clientelism, and outright slavery. And this provided no basis for the plot form of the European novel, which explored the fate of socially constructed individuals adrift in a depersonalized world of commercial relations. The result of this mismatch was a first generation of Brazilian novels that were necessarily superficial and inauthentic, not engaging with the reality of Brazilian society at all. The real history of the Brazilian novel, says Schwartz, began only later, when both the plot form and the narrative voice of the novel were redesigned by the next generation of writers. Only then could the plot form and the narrative voice of the novel begin to express both the different production of individuals in Brazil and the different inner meaning of European ideals like equality and liberty and so on, when they were transferred or transplanted into Brazilian society. And the result of this, says Schwartz, was not just that it produced some great novels, though it clearly did that. It was also a further development of the literary form of the novel itself, which expanded its possibilities beyond the European originals that had been so slavishly copied at the start of the process. What I find so striking here is that this example rediscovers in the sphere of cultural production exactly those consequences of multiplicity that lie at the heart of IR's social ontology: the coexistence and variation of multiple societies, the pressures and opportunities that this creates, which lead to interaction, the innovation of new forms which emerge from the process of hybridization, and then finally, the dialectical structure of the overall process itself. What Schwartz has reconstructed here is an episode in the uneven and combined development of the novel as a modern literary form. But of course, what goes for the novel will surely also go for music, film, architecture, even clothing fashions and cookery. In fact, there's an international relations of just about everything, just like there's a spatiality and a sociology and a politics of just about everything. And that's because societal multiplicity, like spatiality, social structure, and politics, is a general feature of the human world. So its effects will be found in all these different aspects of human life. Applying uneven and combined development in these other fields will enable them to incorporate the international in a much more explicit and successful way, but it will also enrich our conception of the international itself as we follow its causality into one area of life after another. Schwartz's analysis of the 19th century Brazilian novel, I think, is as much a case study in international relations as is John Mearsheimer's critique of Western policy in the Ukraine. Both of them explore the consequences of societal multiplicity for a particular aspect of the human world. And so, as the centenary of IR approaches, I think it's time for us to leave behind the prison of political science. When we reflect on the consequences of multiplicity, we find that the foundations of an independent discipline already exist. If we turn away from our campfires and look outwards, we start to discover the enormous constitutive significance of the international for the social world in all its dimensions. As we piece together the different elements of this, IR surely can become a producer of big ideas for the social sciences and the humanities. We may even stop talking about the end of IR theory and start talking about the beginning of IR theory, because we will realize that in reality, it's only the prehistory of this discipline that has been ending. And if that is the case, then we will indeed have every reason to celebrate. So even though I know this is a bit premature, let me be the first to say it. Happy 100th birthday, IR. Thank you very much.